The school hallways hummed with the steady buzz of a new day. It was a crisp autumn morning, and students rushed between classrooms, backpacks slung over their shoulders, books pressed to their chests. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly, casting a harsh, artificial glow that illuminated the long corridor lined with lockers. The air was thick with the sounds of laughter, the clatter of lockers opening and closing, and the shuffling of hurried footsteps. Amid the chaos, a large banner near the school entrance proclaimed, "Unity and Diversity," a slogan that felt more like a hopeful ideal than a living reality. In the midst of this cacophony stood Principal Stevenson, a man whose very presence seemed to part the crowd. He walked with purpose, his polished shoes clicking sharply on the linoleum floor. His posture was rigid, like a man used to being obeyed, and his expression was as unyielding as the authority he held. Every now and then, his cold, calculating eyes would scan the students, sizing them up, making mental notes about what needed correcting. There was an air of control about him, one that spoke of decades of experience in wielding power, perhaps too much of it. As he moved down the hall, the students instinctively quieted, shifting out of his way like a stream parting around a stone. His gaze swept over them, landing briefly on Miss Amina Thomas, who was standing by a cluster of lockers, talking animatedly to a group of students. Her laughter cut through the air, her easy smile a stark contrast to the stern environment Principal Stevenson had cultivated. Miss Thomas, a woman in her early 30s with natural curls and a vibrant presence, was a teacher the students seemed to gravitate toward. Her classroom was a sanctuary for them, a place where they could discuss history, culture, and identity with passion and respect. Today, she was discussing a project with her students on the Harlem Renaissance, their faces alight with curiosity. Principal Stevenson's gaze sharpened as he approached. He slowed his pace, his eyes narrowing. Miss Thomas noticed him just as he reached her, the shift in the atmosphere palpable. She straightened, offering him a warm but neutral smile. "Good morning, Principal Stevenson," she said, her voice warm but careful. He nodded curtly, his expression never changing. "I trust you're not keeping the students from their studies, Miss Thomas?" His voice was cold, almost accusing, like he already knew the answer. "No, of course not," Miss Thomas replied with a calm, measured tone. "We're just discussing their upcoming project on historical figures. I think they're really starting to connect with the material." Principal Stevenson's eyes flickered to the group of students who had gone silent at his approach. His gaze lingered on them a moment longer than necessary, scanning their faces before returning to Miss Thomas. There was something almost accusatory in his look. "Well," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "we wouldn't want any distractions from their real education. History is important, but so is focus." Miss Thomas nodded, maintaining her composure. "Absolutely, Principal. History is the foundation of everything else we teach." She held his gaze for a moment, silently daring him to challenge her further. He didn't respond to that, instead giving her a thin, tight-lipped smile that never reached his eyes. "I'll be reviewing your syllabus later, Miss Thomas," he said, his tone final. Without waiting for a response, he turned and continued his path down the hallway, his back stiff and imposing. The students slowly started to chatter again, but Miss Thomas remained still, the weight of the encounter settling in her chest. Her students looked at her, concern evident in their expressions. She smiled softly, trying to mask the discomfort. "Don't worry about it," she said, though her voice lacked its usual warmth. "Let's get back to planning your projects." But in the back of her mind, the unease lingered. The tension between her and Stevenson wasn't new, but today, it felt sharper, more deliberate. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something more unsettling. The staff room was quiet, as it always was during the short break between classes. The hum of the vending machines and the soft clink of mugs being set down on tables filled the otherwise silent space. The room was small, its walls covered with outdated notices about professional development days and the occasional poster for a charity drive. The smell of burnt coffee lingered in the air, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. Miss Thomas entered the staff room, hoping for a brief moment of respite. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on a familiar face. Mr. Hernandez, a fellow teacher and the closest thing she had to an ally in this staff room. He was sitting at a small table near the window, sipping his coffee and grading papers. He looked up as she approached, his brow furrowing with a mixture of concern and understanding. "Tough morning?" he asked softly, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. She sat down with a sigh, rubbing the back of her neck. "Same old." Stevenson stopped by the hallway again. "He's not happy about my lessons on the Harlem Renaissance. I can feel it. Something's off today." Mr. Hernandez, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a perpetually weary look, leaned forward, his voice low. "He's been watching you more closely lately. I don't know what it is, but you've been on his radar for a while." Miss Thomas stared down at her coffee, which had gone lukewarm. She had known for some time that Stevenson didn't approve of her teaching style, especially her focus on African American history and culture. She had even overheard some of the other teachers gossiping about her approach, too political, too bold. But she had never let it deter her. Until now. "I don't know, Hernandez. I'm doing my job. I'm teaching them history, the real history, the stuff that's been buried, ignored. But he keeps acting like I'm trying to indoctrinate them, like they can't handle the truth." Hernandez took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes flickering with sympathy. "It's not just about the lessons, Amina. It's about you. You're young, you're passionate, and, let's face it, you're not afraid to challenge the status quo. Stevenson can't stand that." Miss Thomas leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "I don't get it. I thought that's what teaching is supposed to be about, challenging students, making them think for themselves." "Of course, but not everyone sees it that way," Hernandez said, his voice low. "You've got a lot of people in this school who like things just the way they are. Don't rock the boat. And Stevenson? He's the captain of the ship. He doesn't want anyone questioning his authority." She exhaled sharply, staring out the small window overlooking the school courtyard. "I can't let him intimidate me. I won't back down from teaching the truth." Hernandez gave her a reassuring smile. "You've got the right heart, Amina. Just be careful. He's not a man who likes to lose control." As Miss Thomas picked up her coffee, she felt a surge of determination. Hernandez's words lingered, echoing in her mind. She wasn't going to let Stevenson, or anyone, silence her. She'd fight for her students, for her lessons, no matter the cost. But deep down, she knew the fight wouldn't be easy. Principal Stevenson's office was a reflection of the man himself, cold, sterile, and meticulously organized. The walls were lined with certificates and awards, a testament to his long tenure as principal. A massive mahogany desk sat in the center of the room, piles of paperwork neatly arranged in a way that suggested efficiency, or perhaps the illusion of it. Miss Thomas stood across from the desk, trying to keep her composure. Stevenson sat behind it, his fingers steepled in front of him, studying her with an unsettling calm. "Miss Thomas," he began, his voice clipped, "I've been reviewing your recent lessons. I don't think we're on the same page about what should be taught in this school." Miss Thomas felt her heart rate increase, but forced herself to stand tall. "I'm not sure what you mean, Principal Stevenson. I'm teaching history, as it happened, factually and without bias." Stevenson's lips twitched in what might have been the start of a smile, but it was devoid of warmth. "History, you say? Or is it your version of history?" Miss Thomas's chest tightened, but she didn't let her frustration show. "It's the truth. Our students need to know all sides of history, not just the parts that make them comfortable." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Comfortable? I'm not interested in making them comfortable. I'm interested in results. And right now, your methods aren't what I consider productive. They're disruptive." Miss Thomas stood her ground. Teaching the truth is never disruptive. It's necessary. Stevenson's expression hardened. "We'll see about that." The tension in the room thickened, and Miss Thomas could feel it constricting around her. But she held his gaze, unflinching. This wouldn't be the last time they would clash. And this time, she was ready for whatever he threw her way. The staff room was small and stuffy, the walls a dull beige that had long since lost their vibrancy. The tables were scattered with piles of papers, lesson plans, student assignments, stacks of textbooks that had been left in disarray. The flickering hum of the overhead fluorescent lights and the faint smell of stale coffee created an atmosphere of quiet urgency. The few teachers were spread out across the room, sipping coffee, working on papers, or chatting softly, but the mood was anything but relaxed. As Miss Thomas entered, the low murmur of conversation seemed to stutter and die. It wasn't dramatic, but the shift in the air was unmistakable. The teachers in the room looked up for a moment, offering quick, tight smiles before immediately returning to their work. Miss Thomas couldn't help but notice the subtle avoidance in their gaze. They had been treating her differently ever since Principal Stevenson began his quiet scrutiny. She walked toward the coffee machine, trying to ignore the weight of the eyes following her every movement. Her hands, though steady, betrayed a slight tension as she poured herself a cup of coffee. She could almost hear the whispers behind her, rumors that had no names, but everyone seemed to know the gist. Miss Thomas is a troublemaker. She's rocking the boat. She's making waves where there shouldn't be any. At a corner table, Mr. Hernandez, the history teacher she had known for years, caught her eye. He offered a small wave, gesturing for her to sit with him. He was always a calm, steady presence amidst the usual storm of high school politics. She made her way over, setting her coffee cup down with a soft thud. "Rough day?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. His graying hair and tired eyes gave him the air of someone who had seen far too much of the inner workings of the school. She sighed, taking a moment before responding. "I don't know anymore, Hernandez. I thought I was doing everything right, teaching history, teaching the truth. But lately, it feels like I'm the problem." Hernandez watched her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "He's been watching you. You know that, right?" She frowned, her fingers curling slightly around her coffee cup. "I don't know how much longer I can ignore it. Every conversation with him feels like I'm walking on eggshells. I'm just trying to do my job, but somehow it's not good enough." There was a pause as Hernandez picked up his mug and took a sip, his eyes thoughtful. "It's not just about what you're teaching, Amina. It's how you're teaching it. He doesn't like the way you make the students think critically, about race, about the system, about everything. That's dangerous in his eyes. He doesn't want them questioning authority." Miss Thomas frowned, her mind spinning. Dangerous. That word felt like it had been stamped on her soul. It's not dangerous to teach the truth. It's history. Why is he so threatened by it? Hernandez set his mug down slowly, his gaze softening with a touch of sadness. "Because the truth can be uncomfortable, and some people can't handle being uncomfortable. You're asking the students to see the world in a new way, one that challenges everything they've been taught. And Stevenson? He's a man who thrives on control. He doesn't like anyone rocking the boat, especially not you." Miss Thomas looked down at her coffee, the familiar bitterness a sharp contrast to the turmoil brewing inside her. "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this if it keeps escalating." Hernandez's voice dropped lower, more serious now. "Just keep your head down for a while. Don't let him get to you. He's not stupid. He'll make his move soon. But you can't back down, Amina. You can't let him win." A deep sigh escaped her lips. She knew Hernandez was right. The reality of the situation had settled into her bones. She couldn't back down. But she was starting to fear that doing the right thing was going to come at a much higher cost than she had anticipated. The bell rang, signaling the end of the lunch break, and the students flooded back into the classroom, their chatter rising and falling in excitement. Miss Thomas was already at the front of the room, waiting for them. Her classroom, unlike the staff room, was a place of warmth and color. Brightly colored posters of historical figures lined the walls. There were student projects on display, a timeline of the civil rights movement, a map of historical African American communities, a large paper sculpture of the Selma Bridge. Every corner of the room was alive with the energy of the lessons she taught. Today, the class was focused on the civil rights movement and the strategies used by leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Miss Thomas had long prided herself on her ability to make history come alive for her students, but today, There was a weight to the lesson. She could feel it, the undercurrent of tension in the room, as if her students could sense that something was about to change. "All right, class, let's talk about strategy," Miss Thomas began, her voice confident as she addressed her students. What made Dr. King's approach so powerful? Was it just his speeches, or was it the way he mobilized people? And what about Malcolm X? Was his approach any less impactful or just different? The students were engaged, raising their hands and contributing thoughtful ideas. Tasha, a sharp, quiet student in the second row, spoke up first. "I think it was about how people responded to them. Dr. King's message was about nonviolence, but Malcolm X was more direct. People needed both of them, I think." Ms. Thomas smiled, encouraging the students to dig deeper. "Good, Tasha. Dr. King and Malcolm X both had different visions of how change could happen, but they were both pushing for the same thing, justice. But what about today? What do we think about the movements we're seeing now, like Black Lives Matter? Are they the same? How are they different?" The conversation flowed seamlessly, with students challenging each other's perspectives, building on ideas, and questioning assumptions. The energy in the room was electric, and Miss Thomas was just about to pose another question when the door opened with a sharp squeak. In the doorway stood Principal Stevenson, his tall, imposing figure cutting through the vibrancy of the classroom like a storm cloud. His eyes swept over the room, taking in the lively discussion. His face remained impassive, but there was a clear tension in his posture, his shoulders rigid, his jaw tight. Miss Thomas felt the room's energy shift instantly, as if the students could sense his presence, too. The lively debate slowed, and all eyes turned toward the principal. "Miss Thomas," Stevenson's voice was cool, his tone flat but firm. "May I speak with you after class?" There was no warmth in his request, just a command wrapped in the guise of politeness. The students, sensing the change in the air, grew quieter, their attention now split between the principal and their teacher. Miss Thomas held his gaze for a moment before nodding. "Of course, Principal Stevenson." As he stepped out of the doorway, leaving the class in silence, she turned back to her students, the words on the tip of her tongue suddenly caught in her throat. How could she continue teaching when she knew that every word she spoke could be scrutinized, every lesson questioned? The students were staring at her now, some of them glancing nervously, others confused by the sudden tension. Miss Thomas took a deep breath and tried to steady herself. "All right," she said with a forced smile, trying to pull the class back to normal. "Let's keep going. We were talking about the effectiveness of different protest methods." But even as she spoke, her mind was elsewhere. What was coming next? What would Principal Stevenson say? She couldn't shake the feeling that the calm before the storm was over. And now, the real battle was beginning. The following period, Miss Thomas walked to Principal Stevenson's office, her feet heavy with the weight of what she knew was coming. The walls of the principal's office were lined with diplomas and certificates, reminders of Stevenson's long tenure at the school. The space was meticulously organized, each object in its proper place, a stark contrast to the growing chaos she felt inside. Principal Stevenson was sitting behind his desk, his expression unreadable as she stepped inside. He didn't rise, nor did he gesture for her to sit. The coldness of the room seeped into her bones as she remained standing, waiting. "I've been reviewing your curriculum," Stevenson began, his voice cool and controlled, "and I must say, I'm concerned with the direction your lessons are taking." Miss Thomas straightened, trying to keep her composure. "What do you mean?" "You know exactly what I mean," Stevenson said, his voice hardening slightly. "You're introducing ideas that are too radical for our students. They're not ready for this kind of discussion. You're pushing an agenda, Miss Thomas, and it's not the one I approve of." The word stung, but Miss Thomas refused to back down. "I'm teaching them history, Principal. Real history. We can't ignore the struggles, the movements, and the leaders who have shaped our country." Stevenson's lips pressed into a thin line. "And what I'm saying is that we don't need to bring politics into the classroom. Not in the way you're doing. You need to tone it down, or I will have no choice but to take further action." Miss Thomas felt a surge of anger, but she held it in check. If teaching history the way it happened is wrong, then maybe I need to reconsider where I belong. Miss Thomas had always prided herself on being early to class, the quiet moments before the students arrived allowing her to gather her thoughts, reflect on the lesson ahead. But today, those moments felt heavy. As she waited for the bell to ring, she glanced at her desk, where her lesson plan for the day was laid out. She had decided to focus on the Black Power movement, a topic she knew would challenge her students, but one she believed was essential for their understanding of history. As the bell rang, signaling the start of the day, the students filed in, their usual chatter subdued. The energy in the room felt different, almost as if they too could sense the tension that had been building between her and Principal Stevenson. She greeted them as always, but it was clear that some were more reserved today, their eyes flicking toward her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Miss Thomas began her lesson, but her mind wasn't entirely on the material. She had been called to the principal's office the day before, where Stevenson had warned her about the direction her curriculum was taking. He had told her in no uncertain terms that she was pushing an agenda he didn't approve of. The words still echoed in her mind. Tone it down, or else. As the class settled into their discussions about Malcolm X and the Black Panthers, Miss Thomas found it increasingly difficult to focus. She glanced at the doors several times, half expecting Stevenson to appear, watching her from the hallway. When the bell rang, signaling the end of the lesson, she felt a familiar, cold pit settle in her stomach. She had no choice but to face him again. When she stepped into the hallway, she saw Stevenson waiting for her just outside her classroom door. His face was unreadable, but the tension in his posture was unmistakable. Without a word, he gestured for her to follow him down the hall. Miss Thomas followed, her heart pounding in her chest. He led her to his office and shut the door behind them with a quiet click. "Sit down, Miss Thomas," he said, his voice tight. She complied, her palms sweating despite the calm exterior she tried to maintain. "You're pushing boundaries, and I'm not sure you understand the consequences," he said, sitting across from her. His tone was businesslike, but there was an edge to it that made her stomach churn. "I've had complaints. From parents. From staff. What you're teaching, how you're teaching it. This isn't just about history, Miss Thomas. It's about something much more dangerous." Miss Thomas felt a flicker of anger rise within her, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm teaching them the truth, Principal. History isn't just the stories we're comfortable hearing. It's about understanding the past, even when it's difficult." Stevenson's jaw tightened. "What you're teaching them goes beyond understanding. It's stirring up trouble. I've spoken to the board, and they're not happy. You need to stop pushing these radical ideas." "I'm not teaching radical ideas," she said, leaning forward, her hands gripping the armrests of the chair. "I'm teaching them to think critically. I'm teaching them about the struggle for justice, about the voices that shaped our country. I can't just teach them the sanitized version of history. They deserve to know the full story." Stevenson's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a thin, controlled smile. "And if I tell you to stop? If I tell you that continuing down this path will cost you your job?" Miss Thomas's heart raced, but she stood her ground. "Then I will walk out of this office and keep teaching my students the truth, because that's all I'm doing, Principal. I'm not here to make people comfortable. I'm here to make them think." Stevenson's gaze hardened. "You're playing a dangerous game, Miss Thomas. Don't make me do what I have to do. You have until the end of the week to reconsider your approach." With that, he stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. Miss Thomas, though her insides were boiling, remained calm. She nodded once and walked out, the door clicking shut behind her with a finality that sent a shiver down her spine. The next day, the tension in the school had only grown. Miss Thomas could feel it in the way the teachers avoided eye contact, in the way her students were watching her more closely than usual. The whispers were growing louder. She knew that the other teachers were aware of the pressure she was under, but none of them dared to speak up, not openly at least. During lunch in the staff room, Mr. Hernandez was the only one who didn't shy away from her. He caught her eye as she walked in, and without a word, he slid into the seat next to her. She didn't even need to ask if he had heard about her meeting with Stevenson. His somber expression said everything. "They won't say it to your face, Amina," he said quietly, leaning in. "But you're not alone in this. We're all behind you. But you have to be careful. This isn't just about your curriculum anymore. It's about power." Miss Thomas nodded, though a part of her wished it wasn't true. "I can't back down, Hernandez. Not now. I'm teaching them what they need to know, even if it makes people uncomfortable." Hernandez's expression softened. "I know you. You won't stop. But remember, sometimes the fight isn't just about standing tall. It's about knowing when to fight." As the lunch period came to an end, they both stood, each of them walking in different directions. But as Miss Thomas passed the staff lounge door, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting in the school. She had heard the whispers from the other teachers, the quiet condemnation. But Mr. Hernandez's words stuck with her. "We're all behind you." She wasn't alone in this fight. The days dragged on, and the tension between Miss Thomas and Principal Stevenson only deepened. Every lesson she taught felt like an act of defiance. Every word she spoke, every lesson she planned, was under scrutiny. She could feel eyes on her wherever she went. Eyes from the other teachers, from the administration, even from her students. They were watching her, waiting for her to slip up. It wasn't long before the breaking point arrived. During a routine faculty meeting, Stevenson pulled her aside. His eyes were cold, and the force of his gaze made her stomach twist with unease. "I warned you, Miss Thomas," he said, his voice low and steady. "I gave you a chance to change, but instead, you've gone out of your way to defy me, and now I have no choice." He handed her a letter, and she unfolded it with a sinking feeling in her chest. It was a formal notice. Her lesson plans had been deemed unsuitable by the school board, and she was officially being placed on probation. If she continued with her current approach, she would be fired. Her heart raced as she read the letter, the weight of it almost unbearable. The room seemed to close in around her. "This is it," she thought. "They're going to make me leave." Stevenson watched her closely, his lips barely twitching into something resembling a smile. "You have one last chance to reconsider, Miss Thomas. You've been warned." Without a word, Miss Thomas folded the letter, slipping it into her bag. She knew what she had to do. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about her students. She couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything she had fought for. As she turned and walked out of the room, her mind was already made up. She wouldn't let him win. Not today. Not ever. The weight of the letter sat heavily in Miss Thomas's bag, but in her mind, it had already become a symbol of the line drawn between her and Principal Stevenson. He had given her an ultimatum, but she wasn't one to back down in the face of adversity. She had made up her mind. There was no turning back. That evening, as the school emptied out and the last students trickled out of the doors, Miss Thomas sat alone in her classroom, the room dim and quiet. The walls, filled with the faces of history's trailblazers, stood as silent witnesses to the battle that was about to unfold. She stared at the lesson plan she had been working on for the next week, one that would delve deeper into the Black Power movement, continuing to challenge her students to think critically about the world around them. Her fingers hovered over the desk, tracing the edge of her planner as the weight of her decisions settled in. She had spent years building her career, earning the respect of her students and colleagues alike. But it had all come down to this one moment. If she stood her ground, she could lose everything. If she backed down, everything she stood for would crumble. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She would not back down. The next morning, Miss Thomas stepped into the classroom with the same resolve. The students were already settling into their seats, casting curious glances toward her. She could feel the uncertainty in the air, but she refused to let it affect her. Today, the lesson would go forward, and she would teach it as she had always intended, with truth, with passion, and with the conviction that history could not, and would not, be sanitized. "Good morning, class," she said, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of strength. She noticed Tasha immediately, sitting up straighter than usual, her eyes meeting Miss Thomas's with an unspoken understanding. It was clear that the students had been talking. They knew something was different today. "We're going to continue our conversation about the Black Power movement," Miss Thomas said, her voice unwavering as she walked to the front of the room. She could feel their eyes on her. Students who admired her. Students who might not always agree. and the ones who quietly looked to her for guidance. She could feel the power of their attention, but she knew it was up to her to decide what to do with it. "We're going to discuss the importance of self-determination," she continued, her hand gripping the chalk as she wrote the words on the board. "Of pride, of community, and of resisting the forces that seek to oppress you." The words hit the room with a palpable force. The students, ever perceptive, noticed the quiet defiance in Miss Thomas's voice. The lesson wasn't just about the past. It was about them, right here, right now. She moved through the lesson as planned, speaking of Stokely Carmichael and the Black Panther Party, their messages of empowerment, their vision for social change, and the ways in which they had challenged the systemic oppression of their time. As she spoke, she could see some of the students nodding along, eager to learn, eager to hear the truths that had been buried too long. But she could also see others fidgeting, their discomfort unmistakable. "It's not always easy to hear the truth," she said, pausing for a moment, letting her words sink in. "But we cannot allow fear or discomfort to silence us. If we do, we become complicit in our own oppression." Tasha raised her hand. "Ms. Thomas, do you think it's possible to keep pushing for change when people in power are trying to shut us down?" Ms. Thomas looked at her, her heart swelling with pride for the young woman sitting in front of her. This was why she taught. This was why the truth had to be told. "It's possible, Tasha, but it's not easy. When you speak the truth, it makes some people uncomfortable. They'll try to silence you. They'll try to make you feel small. But we stand strong because we know that what we're fighting for is bigger than any threat they can give us." The bell rang, signaling the end of the class. The students filed out slowly, many of them stopping to thank Miss Thomas or offering a quiet nod of respect. She watched them go, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The room, once heavy with uncertainty, now felt lighter. She had made her stand, and she knew her students would stand with her. Later that afternoon, as Miss Thomas prepared for the next lesson, the phone on her desk rang. She hesitated before picking it up. She knew who it would be. "Miss Thomas." The voice on the other end was cool, controlled. It was Principal Stevenson, his tone as sharp as ever. "I need to see you in my office. Now." Her heart skipped a beat, but she stood tall, her resolve never wavering. She had known this moment would come. When she arrived at his office, Stevenson was already sitting behind his desk, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on the papers in front of him. He didn't look up when she entered. "Sit down," he said, his voice steady but laced with an unmistakable tension. Miss Thomas did as instructed, the air thick with the unspoken history of this conflict. "I warned you, Miss Thomas," he began, his words measured. "You've crossed a line. The school board is aware of your actions. There's been a formal complaint from several parents regarding your approach. You've been putting your students in a difficult position, and you've refused to listen to the guidance I've given you." Miss Thomas met his gaze without hesitation. "I'm not going to apologize for teaching the truth, Principal. My students have the right to learn about their history, the real history, not the sanitized version that makes people comfortable." Stevenson leaned forward slightly, his jaw tightening. "I've tried to be patient, Miss Thomas, but your defiance has left me with no other option. I'm recommending that you be removed from the classroom." The word stung, but Miss Thomas didn't flinch. She had been expecting this moment for days. She had already made up her mind. "Then you'll have to remove me, Principal, because I won't stop teaching my students what they need to know. If that costs me my job, then I will accept the consequences. But I will not be silenced." For a moment, there was a heavy silence. Stevenson stared at her, his lips pressed together in a thin line. Then, slowly, he stood up. "You've made your choice," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "I've made my choice," Miss Thomas replied firmly. As she turned to leave his office, she knew that this battle was far from over. But it didn't matter. She was ready. She had already decided what she was fighting for, and nothing, no threat, no ultimatum, would change that. The following day, word had already spread throughout the school. Miss Thomas was no longer just a teacher standing up for what she believed in. She was a symbol. The students, who had been silently observing the growing tension, were beginning to take action. Tasha and a few other students approached Miss Thomas after class, their faces filled with determination. "Miss Thomas," Tasha said, her voice steady, "we want to help. We're not going to let them shut you down." Miss Thomas looked at them, pride swelling in her chest. "You're already helping," she said softly. "By speaking up, by standing with me, you're already doing more than I could ever ask." Tasha and the others exchanged looks, then nodded. "We'll start a petition," Tasha said. "We'll talk to the other teachers, the students, everyone. We'll show them we're with you." Miss Thomas smiled, her heart full. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The following days felt like a whirlwind. News of Miss Thomas's stand had spread far beyond the classroom walls. Students, many of them quiet or reserved in the past, were now speaking out, organizing, sharing their support, and rallying behind her. Tasha, along with a group of other students, took the lead in organizing a petition to show their support. They plastered the halls with flyers, circulated the petition during lunch periods, and spoke to their peers about what was at stake. Miss Thomas watched from a distance, her heart swelling with pride as her students took charge of the fight she had started. The hallways were filled with a buzz of conversation. Some supportive, some skeptical, but all talking about the issue at hand. One afternoon, Tasha came up to Miss Thomas, her hands shaking slightly as she handed over a stack of signed petitions. "We've got over 100 signatures already, and it's only been a day." Miss Thomas smiled. "You've all done an incredible job. I can't tell you how much this means to me." But Tasha looked at her with a furrowed brow. "It's not just for you, Miss Thomas. It's for all of us. For our right to learn. For the truth." Miss Thomas's throat tightened. She wasn't just fighting for her career now. She was fighting for her students, for their right to think critically, to challenge the status quo, to understand the world in its full complexity. The tension in the school grew palpable as the school board meeting loomed closer. It was scheduled for the following week, and Miss Thomas had been informed that she would be expected to defend her approach to teaching. The petition, the support from her students, it all led to this moment. On the morning of the meeting, Miss Thomas walked into her classroom, where her students were already waiting. They were quiet, their faces set with determination. Tasha was the first to speak. "We're going to be there, Miss Thomas," she said. "We're going to stand with you." Miss Thomas nodded. "Thank you, Tasha. But remember, this isn't just about me. It's about all of us. About our right to learn, to challenge, to ask questions." As the bell rang and the students began to file out of the room, Miss Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a classroom fight. It was a community fight, a fight for education itself. Principal Stevenson had grown more impatient in recent days. Word from the school board indicated that the pressure was mounting, and he had been tasked with making sure Miss Thomas's lesson plans were scrutinized. Stevenson's words had shifted from subtle threats to outright commands. His frustration was now visible in every interaction, his eyes constantly scanning for the smallest reason to discredit Miss Thomas. That afternoon, Miss Thomas received a call to meet with Stevenson once again. When she entered his office, he was already sitting at his desk, a stack of papers in front of him. The tension was thick in the air, as though both of them knew the meeting could go in any direction. "Miss Thomas," Stevenson began. His voice clipped. "I've been reviewing your lesson plans and the feedback from the board. They've decided to implement a formal review of your teaching materials. You will be required to present your curriculum to the board in 2 days." Miss Thomas didn't flinch. "I've already submitted everything they asked for. I've been transparent about my methods. What more do they want?" Stevenson's eyes narrowed. "What they want is for you to stop stirring the pot. You're making waves, Miss Thomas, and I'm warning you again. If you don't comply, there will be consequences." Her gaze locked with his. "I'm not here to make people comfortable, Principal. I'm here to teach my students the truth." Stevenson leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. "We'll see how well that attitude serves you when the board makes their decision." Miss Thomas turned to leave, her mind already racing with thoughts of the upcoming board meeting. She knew the stakes were higher now. It wasn't just about her job anymore. It was about standing up for everything she believed in. By the time the day of the board meeting arrived, the school was a battleground. tensions had reached a boiling point. The support from Miss Thomas had grown stronger. Students continued to rally around her. Teachers, though hesitant to speak out publicly, offered quiet support. Even some parents had joined the effort, calling the school to express their concern over the administration's treatment of Miss Thomas. When Miss Thomas arrived at the board meeting that evening, she was met by a sea of familiar faces, students who had come to speak, parents who had come to listen, and even a few teachers who quietly slipped into the back of the room to show their solidarity. As she took her seat at the front of the room, she felt a surge of pride. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was theirs. The board meeting started like any other. There was a lot of procedural business to get through before Miss Thomas's case was called. But when the time came, all eyes were on her. Stevenson stood at the front, ready to present his case against her, his tone measured but cold. Miss Thomas has repeatedly ignored the guidelines set forth by the district and has chosen to teach controversial materials that go against the school's mission. The petition created by her students is based on misguided views and distorts the values we aim to instill in our students. Miss Thomas stood up, feeling a rush of determination. She had rehearsed her speech in her head 100 times. But now that she was here, facing the people who held her future in their hands, her words felt more powerful than she could have imagined. I am not here to defend myself. I am here to defend the students who sit in this room, who trust me to teach them the truth, she began, her voice strong and clear. I am here to defend the right to teach history as it happened, not as some wishful version of it. These students are not misguided, they are empowered, and they deserve the opportunity to learn about the world and its complexity. As she spoke, she saw the faces of her students in the crowd. Tasha, Jamal, Lena. Their eyes were fixed on her, full of pride and support. Miss Thomas continued, each word cutting through the air like a promise. I will not teach to make anyone comfortable. I will not stand by and let my students be denied their right to learn. We are all responsible for shaping the future, and we do that by understanding the past, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. The room was silent for a moment, and then, one by one, people began to speak in her defense. Mr. Hernandez was the first, his voice steady as he spoke of the importance of teaching history with honesty and integrity. Soon, other teachers, parents, and students followed suit, each one speaking with conviction. The board members deliberated for what seemed like hours. Miss Thomas sat in the front row, her heart racing as she waited for their decision. She knew this moment would determine more than just her future. It would determine whether or not her students would be allowed to continue their education unfiltered, unafraid. Finally, the chairperson of the board stood up, her expression somber but thoughtful. After hearing all the testimonies and reviewing the case, the board has decided. Miss Thomas's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. As the room fell silent in anticipation, to allow Miss Thomas to continue teaching with full support from the district. However, there will be guidelines moving forward for how controversial materials are handled. Miss Thomas will work closely with the administration to ensure that future lessons align with district policies. A wave of relief washed over Miss Thomas, but as the applause began to fill the room, she knew that the battle wasn't over. It was only just beginning. In the days following the board's decision, Miss Thomas felt a strange sense of peace. The battle had been won, but only just. The guidelines the board had put in place were vague and left much room for interpretation, but at least she could continue her work without the looming threat of immediate dismissal. However, she knew that Stevenson's watchful eye would never fully leave her. Back in the classroom, things were different now. There was a new sense of urgency in her lessons, a deeper connection between her and her students. The support they had shown her during the board meeting had meant more than she could express. But the reality was clear. The victory was only temporary, and the system still held power over her. As Miss Thomas began teaching again, the atmosphere in her classroom had subtly shifted. The students had grown more engaged, and their discussions more passionate. They spoke openly about race, power, and resistance, often connecting what they were learning to current events in the world. Tasha, in particular, had grown into a quiet leader in the class, challenging her peers to think beyond what they had been taught in previous years. "Miss Thomas," Tasha said one afternoon, her eyes bright with excitement, "have you seen what's been happening on the news? People are still fighting for justice, just like the Panthers did. It's like everything we've talked about is happening right now." Miss Thomas smiled at Tasha's enthusiasm. "Exactly. This isn't just history, it's life. And it's happening all around us. That's why we can't just learn about the past. We have to see how it influences our present." Her students were no longer passive learners. They were actively participating in the world, asking questions, demanding answers. But Miss Thomas knew that, as much as she could see their growth, the real test of the fight she had started would come in the months ahead. Despite the victory, Principal Stevenson had made his displeasure clear. He had not yet interfered directly, but Miss Thomas knew it was only a matter of time before the tension between them would boil over again. His silence was more unsettling than any of the confrontations they had had in the past. It felt as though he was biding his time, waiting for her to slip up, or for the system to give him an excuse to act. One day, after school, as she packed up her things, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching her classroom door. She turned and saw Stevenson standing in the doorway, his face impassive, his hands clasped behind his back. "Miss Thomas," he began, his voice cool, "I trust you are abiding by the new guidelines?" "I am," she replied evenly. "I'm teaching the curriculum, just as I always have. But I won't compromise on what matters. My students deserve to learn the truth, not just what's comfortable." Stevenson didn't move, but his eyes hardened. "You've been given a chance, Miss Thomas. Don't make me take it away." Miss Thomas didn't flinch. "I'm not afraid of you, Principal, and I won't let fear dictate how I teach." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, without another word, Stevenson turned and left the room. Miss Thomas exhaled, the weight of the encounter settling deep in her chest. She knew she couldn't relax. The fight wasn't over. It had only shifted into a different phase, one that was more dangerous, more subtle, and she would have to be prepared for whatever came next. The following week, Miss Thomas found an unexpected ally in Mrs. Jackson, a teacher she had always admired but had never spoken to much outside of occasional staff meetings. Mrs. Jackson was a quiet, older teacher who had spent years in the classroom, but who had always avoided direct confrontation with the administration. But now, things were different. "Miss Thomas," Mrs. Jackson said, approaching her after class one afternoon, "I wanted to speak to you. I know you're under a lot of pressure, but I also know what you're doing is right, and I want you to know that you're not alone." Miss Thomas blinked in surprise. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Jackson glanced around the hallway, then lowered her voice. "I've seen the way Stevenson has been treating you, the way he's been treating us all. But you're standing up for something important, and that's something I can't ignore anymore. I've been teaching here for 20 years, and I've never seen anyone like you. You're giving these kids something they've never had before, a voice." Miss Thomas felt a lump form in her throat. "I don't want to lose my job, Mrs. Jackson, but I can't stop. Not now. Not with everything I've worked for." "You won't lose your job," Mrs. Jackson said firmly. "Not if we stand together. There are more of us who agree with you than you think. We may not have been as vocal as you, but we're watching. We'll have your back." Her words were like a lifeline, pulling Miss Thomas out of the uncertainty that had been gnawing at her. For the first time in a long while, she felt a surge of hope. The fight was not hers alone. It didn't take long for the board to schedule another visit. The district had been monitoring the situation closely, and the increased attention from both students and teachers had made them nervous. They wanted to see the situation for themselves. Miss Thomas had known it was only a matter of time before they would visit her class. She had prepared for this moment. She had spent the past few days refining her curriculum, ensuring that every lesson plan met the new guidelines while still keeping the integrity of her teaching intact. When the board members arrived, they were accompanied by Principal Stevenson, who stood silently in the back of the room, watching Miss Thomas closely. The visitors were quiet, their eyes scanning the room as Miss Thomas began her lesson on the civil rights movement, focusing on Dr. King's philosophy of nonviolent protest and how it had influenced social justice movements around the world. As she taught, she could feel their eyes on her. She didn't allow herself to be distracted, but she couldn't ignore the pressure. The students seemed to feel it too. They were quiet today, almost overly aware of the scrutiny. When the lesson was over, the board members filed out of the room. Stevenson stayed behind, and for a moment, the silence between him and Miss Thomas was suffocating. "You did well today," he said, his voice cold but measured. "But don't think this means anything. You're still on thin ice." Miss Thomas didn't respond. She knew better than to engage in another argument. But in the pit of her stomach, she knew one thing. She was not backing down. The final tipping point came a few days later, when the students, led by Tasha, decided to take matters into their own hands. They had been organizing a rally for days, hoping to bring attention to the injustice of trying to silence their voices. They believed in Miss Thomas, and they were willing to risk their own futures to ensure she could keep teaching. On the day of the rally, Miss Thomas found herself at the center of a growing crowd of students, parents, and even a few teachers who had come to show their support. The courtyard was filled with signs, some reading, "Save Our History," and others boldly stating truth over comfort. The energy was electric, a testament to how deeply the issue had resonated with the community. Miss Thomas stood on the steps of the school building, her heart pounding as she looked at the sea of faces. She had never wanted to become a symbol, but in this moment, that was exactly what she was. The students were chanting, their voices rising in unison, a clear message. They would not be silenced. Tasha stepped up to the front, holding a microphone. "This is about more than just Miss Thomas. It's about our right to learn. We are not afraid of the truth." The crowd cheered. Miss Thomas felt a rush of gratitude wash over her. She had fought for them, but now it was clear. They were fighting for her. The momentum of the student rally carried over into the next few weeks. The support from Ms. Thomas was undeniable, and the administration, including Principal Stevenson, seemed to be on edge. The tension in the halls grew more palpable, with whispers spreading among the students and staff. Ms. Thomas, however, remained focused on her students. Each day, she poured her heart into the lessons, helping her students navigate the complexities of history, encouraging them to think critically, to challenge norms, and to find their voices. The classroom had become a sanctuary, a place where the students could openly discuss the realities of race, injustice, and power without fear of reprisal. But outside the classroom, the situation was worsening. The school board had become more involved, and Stevenson, in particular, had grown more aggressive in his attempts to control what was being taught. He made it clear to Miss Thomas in private meetings that her activism was becoming problematic. He had started calling her lesson plans into question more frequently, nitpicking every detail in an effort to find an excuse to remove her from the classroom. It was becoming harder to ignore the tension. The school was on the verge of another confrontation, and everyone knew it. One afternoon, Miss Thomas was called into a meeting with Principal Stevenson and the district superintendent, a stern-faced woman named Miss Harper. As she entered the room, she noticed the coldness in their eyes, the formality of their posture. This was no longer just about teaching, it was about control. "Miss Thomas," Stevenson began, his voice laced with authority, "I'm sure you're aware that the board has expressed concerns about the recent protests. Your students have been openly defying the school's policies, and your teaching methods have been called into question." Miss Harper leaned forward. "We've given you numerous opportunities to amend your curriculum to align with district standards. However, it's become clear that you are unwilling to make those changes." Miss Thomas remained calm, but inside, she felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "I have always followed the district's guidelines in my lesson planning, and I have worked hard to ensure that my students are engaged in critical thinking, not mere memorization. I will not change that." Stevenson's expression hardened. "That's a mistake, Miss Thomas. You're making this more difficult than it needs to be. We've given you plenty of chances to comply. If you continue down this path, there will be consequences. You may be dismissed from your position." The words hit her like a punch in the gut. Dismissed. For teaching the truth. For empowering her students. Miss Thomas fought to maintain her composure, her voice steady. "I won't apologize for teaching my students to think for themselves. And I won't apologize for challenging them to understand the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it makes some people." Harper's eyes narrowed. "You leave us no choice. We'll be reviewing your teaching position very closely in the coming days. Be prepared for the consequences." With that, they stood and ended the meeting. Miss Thomas walked out of the room with a sense of finality in her steps. She knew that this wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration. They were going to do everything in their power to silence her. The next few days were filled with uncertainty. Miss Thomas spent hours in her classroom, planning lessons, talking with her students, and preparing for the worst. She had already made peace with the fact that her position might be on the line, but she couldn't stop teaching. Not now, not after everything she had fought for. Her students could sense the tension, and their support never wavered. They continued to hold rallies, write petitions, and spread the word about the importance of what Miss Thomas was doing. They knew that this wasn't just a fight for one teacher. It was a fight for their right to a complete, unfiltered education. Tasha, who had become the unofficial spokesperson for the students, approached Miss Thomas one afternoon after class. "We can't let them win, Miss Thomas. We can't let them take away what you've given us." Miss Thomas looked at Tasha, her heart swelling with pride. "I've given you the tools, Tasha. You already have what you need to make change. Don't let anyone take that from you." But Tasha shook her head. "No, this is bigger than just a few lesson plans. You've taught us to speak up, to stand up for what's right. We're not backing down, not without a fight." Her words struck Miss Thomas deep. The students were ready. They were prepared to stand with her, to support her in the fight for their education. Later that night, as she sat in her apartment, Miss Thomas made a decision. She wasn't going to back down. No matter what happened next, she would stand for her students. She would fight, not just for her job, but for the future of education. She knew she was risking everything, but she couldn't stop now. The day of the board's final decision arrived, and the tension was unbearable. Miss Thomas arrived at the school early, her mind racing with a mix of fear and determination. She had heard rumors that the board had already made their decision, but no one knew for sure what it would be. Some believed they would fire her. Others hoped they would compromise. As she walked through the halls, she noticed that the students were in full force. They had gathered again, standing outside the school with signs and banners, chanting for her right to teach. The atmosphere was electric, filled with hope, anger, and defiance. The board meeting was scheduled for the afternoon, and Miss Thomas knew it would be a defining moment. She couldn't afford to go in there without a plan. With the support of her students, teachers, and even some parents, she was ready to make her case again. She wouldn't let them take away the one thing that had made a difference in her life, her ability to teach freely. The boardroom was packed with people, board members, parents, students, and teachers, all gathered to witness the final decision. Stevenson was there, standing at the back with a stern expression, but Miss Thomas wasn't intimidated anymore. She had seen this moment coming. When her name was called, she stood up and walked to the front of the room. The room fell silent as she addressed the board, her voice calm but firm. "I'm here today because I believe in my students. I believe in their right to learn the truth, to question, to think critically, to challenge the world around them. And I believe in my right to teach them that. I will not teach to appease anyone. I will not back down. Not now, not ever." Her words hung in the air. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, one by one, her students began to stand, their voices rising in unison. "This is not just about a classroom," Miss Thomas continued. "This is about our future. It's about the kind of world we want to create. A world where truth and justice are not optional." The board members exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the chairperson of the board finally spoke. "Miss Thomas, your passion for your students is clear. However, we still have to consider the guidelines set forth by the district." Just as she prepared for the worst, the chairperson paused and then spoke again, this time with a surprising tone of finality. "We've decided to allow you to continue teaching, with one condition. You will work closely with the administration to ensure your materials align with district standards moving forward. However, we will no longer interfere with your approach to teaching history." A collective gasp filled the room. The decision was unexpected, but it was a victory, a hard-won one. Miss Thomas could hardly believe her ears. She had one. The students erupted into cheers, their voices echoing through the halls. Miss Thomas felt a rush of emotion overwhelm her. She had fought for what was right, and in the end, they had all won. As the students crowded around her, hugging her and congratulating her, Tasha stepped forward. "You did it, Miss Thomas. We did it. We're not going to stop. This is just the beginning." Miss Thomas smiled, tears in her eyes. "You're right, Tasha. This is just the beginning." As she looked at the faces of her students who had become so much more than learners, but active participants in their own futures, she realized something. This fight wasn't just about teaching history. It was about teaching them to write their own stories, to claim their own voices. The victory was theirs, too, and that was something no one could take away.